Everybody, we're going to get started in a moment.
Okay, I'm here. Hi, everyone. We'll give it another minute and then we'll start. We'll give some people a little bit more time to check in. In the meantime, if you would please introduce yourself in the chat, put your name and affiliation. And Susan, can you bring up the PowerPoint, or do you want me to do that?
Hopefully, folks are seeing the PowerPoint.
Yes, I can see it.
Hmm. Okay. All right, it's 1:03, so we'll get started. Susan, can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so welcome everybody again. Thank you for those who have just joined. Please put your name in the chat and your affiliation, so we'll introduce ourselves that way. We're going to try a different method of operation today because it was a little difficult for us last time to um, track two conversations, one in the chat, one in voice. So this time we're going to ask you please to come off mute to make your comments and make your comments in voice. Use the chat only for these introductions to let us know of any technical issues or to share links. And I'm actually going to do that right now. I'm going to share a link. Sorry. And I'm going to ask you to, I'm going to ask you to follow this link. And did I send it? No, there we go. Okay, I'm going to ask you to follow the link and please download the meeting materials. You can download the agenda too if you want, but please download the meeting materials. And do you have any questions about this at this point? I'll give you a minute to do that. So let's see, where are we? Okay. Okay, so just to make sure, is there anybody who is having any technical difficulties at this time? If there is, please raise your hand and we'll get to you and help. Okay, so let's move along. Susan, can you change the slide, please? Thank you. Okay, so the purpose of today's meeting is to identify criteria, as this says, for prioritizing jurisdictions to receive grants. This is something that FEMA requires us to do, and we do it both for mitigation planning grants, capability and capacity building, which are related to mitigation planning in that they're not physical project grants, and also grants for mitigation projects in both pre-disaster grants and post-disaster grants. So that I don't know how clear that is to everybody, but mitigation planning is generally associated with writing for the first time or updating a natural hazards mitigation plan or a community wildfire plan. And capability and capacity building can be things like creating public-private partnerships or doing trainings that can help people have more capacity, say, to even apply for grants. Mitigation projects are sort of groundbreaking things. And the pre-disaster environment, that is when FEMA or another federal agency or some other entity, private entity or foundation or something, offers a grant opportunity without there having been a disaster. It can be something that's offered annually on a regular schedule, or it can be something that comes up as a one-time opportunity, but it doesn't depend on a disaster. And then other grants do depend on there having been a disaster. So that's the pre-disaster and post-disaster environments. Questions? Okay, next slide, please. Susan? Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Christina, yes.
Sorry, just a clarifying question, I think. So in general, big perspective, I usually think of FEMA as being an OEM working together as being the ones to prioritize where grant funding goes or makes those decisions. How do we intersect with that decision process? Can you explain that a little more?
Yes, right here on this slide.
Okay.
Perfect. Perfect segue. Okay, so in the state natural hazard mitigation planning policy guide that we follow to update our state natural hazard mitigation plan, FEMA requires us to include these criteria. And as you said, every FEMA grant offering and other grant offerings, whether they're public or private, have their own criteria that you have to meet for getting awarded the grants. They often have scoring rubrics. So when OEM is looking at those particular grants in the post-disaster environment, and those would be HMGP or HMGP post-fire, that's Hazard Mitigation Grant Program or Hazard Mitigation Grant Program post-fire, there is a certain way that those grants are awarded. They go first to the counties that are identified in the disaster declaration as having been affected. And then after those counties are taken care of, then whatever monies are left can go to other communities across the state. For pre-disaster grants from FEMA in particular, those grants are flood mitigation assistance and building resilience in communities, or BRIC. And those come out every year, and each notice of funding opportunity, or NOFO, or has its own criteria and scoring rubric. And so those are the first things that that OEM has to work with to make sure that um, the applications meet those criteria. But at the same time, the criteria that we're going to talk about today will be a touchstone for for OEM. I keep making that mistake. I apologize. There'll be a touchstone. There'll be sort of a 30,000 foot level. Some of them are less than 30,000 feet, but they'll be in the background, but like the overarching guide to include when you're looking at the specific grant offering requirements, or scoring rubrics. So FEMA really has OEM. Gosh, I'm sorry. OEM really needs to use both of them together. The particular grant offering criteria, and then try to work that with the criteria that we're going to talk about today. Okay, is Kale, Daniel, or John Weeby on the line? I can't tell.
I'm here.
Kale's here. And
Mhm.
John? Is John here too?
I don't know if John is.
Okay, would you like to talk about anything that I just said, or correct anything I just said?
Yeah,
Or
no, that all
okay.
is correct. It's gonna pull up. So we did just open the grant for the 2024 wildfires. And
Mhm.
so we do have them categorized by directly affected communities. And Uh, then if you have a natural, you have to have a FEMA approved NHMP. You need to be in an underserved or underrepresented area and have had zero to limit or little grant funding in the past. So there is a scoring rubrics that we use internally for OEM in conjunction with FEMA.
Okay, thank you. And then
Mhm.
these criteria that we're going to be talking about today are supposed to be used along with those, to the extent that you can, um, to guide your final decisions. Okay, so does that make it clear as mud, Christina?
It certainly helps, Marion. I appreciate it. I guess maybe, Kale, maybe that you could help me shed a little light on, are you making up like a scoring rubric and you're going to weight these criteria evenly or on a different distribution, weighted in a different way compared to what your OEM, and obviously meeting minimum FEMA criteria as well.
Yeah, so I have gone through one scoring grant round so far of pre-applications. And it was, we've received just a small handful of them, and there was only one that was in the directly affected area, so it made it pretty easy.
Mhm.
We did not have to use a formal scoring rubrics for that because it was evident who was going to be number one. They were the only affected county, and then we went to number two, which was a community that did not have an updated NHMP. And so they were applying to get that updated. So we want them to have that.
Mhm.
So they were number two, and then the rest of them were communities that had not been affected in the disaster, but we had a lot of big bucket of money still left. So I anticipate a more formal scoring rubrics that we'll use for the 2024 wildfires. We have more money, and I anticipate more applications coming through. So,
That's helpful. Thank you.
mhm.
Yeah, the bottom line is that it's a little bit fuzzy, the relationship between um, these two sets of criteria, but we need to consider what we're doing today, as the planning kind of criteria that need to be connected with the actual grant scoring or criteria rubric. And we're taking some of that into account in these two. FEMA requires that. So you'll see that there are a lot of criteria that FEMA requires or suggests, and then we'll be able to, there were, when we were putting this meeting together, we had a planning team of DLCD and OEM people, and we came up with a couple of other criteria, and you'll have a chance to propose more today, discuss the ones that we came up with. And then the next meeting will be where we take the criteria that we come up with today and prioritize them. So the focus is on, it's a little, there's kind of a fine line. It's a different flavor, maybe a little bit of you could say this is criteria for awarding grants, but also the way that FEMA frames it is these are criteria for determining jurisdictions to receive grants. It's a very I don't know, it's a little bit different, but not a lot different. It's just a different kind of framing of the question. So the other thing that FEMA says in the guide for the state plans is that these are not only for these criteria that we're coming up with today are not only for these FEMA program, mitigation program grants, but also it could be other federal grants, it could be non-federal programs. So we need to think about this in a little bit bigger of a view. So with that all a little bit fuzzy, let's move to the next slide. Okay, so if you haven't downloaded the meeting materials today, if you came a little bit late, this is the link to do it again. It's also in the chat, so please go ahead and do that now. And while you're doing that, we'll move on. One more slide, please. Thank you. No, no, no. No, no. There should, okay. All right, so let's, Susan, can you put up the materials from today at this point?
I'm working on it. Sorry.
Okay,
Share screen. Okay.
sorry.
Where is it? No, you're good. There we go. I just still think I'm sharing. There, hopefully you're seeing a
Oh,
Word document. Yes.
It's just coming up. Okay, can you make it bigger, please? Like real big? And go to the top. I mean, the first page. Okay. So, and can you make this bigger too again? Sorry. Okay, so this is FEMA's required. If you can scroll down just so we have the text on the screen, that'd be great. Thanks. So these are FEMA's requirements from the mitigation policy guide for state plans. And so the first thing it says is, I'm sorry for reading this to you, but I will. The plan must describe criteria for prioritizing jurisdictions to receive planning and project grants. So here, this is what I was saying before about the flavor. This doesn't say these are the criteria for, whoops, your screen left. These are the criteria for awarding grants. It says these are the criteria for deciding which jurisdictions should receive the grants. Whoops.
Yeah. So we have multiple screens. I'm going to share that again. I got it.
Okay. I can put it up too if necessary.
Nope, the slideshow was getting in the way. So, here we go.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we have to describe the criteria for prioritizing jurisdictions to receive planning and project grants under available federal and non-federal programs. A principal criterion for prioritizing grants will be the degree to which benefits are maximized. Areas of consideration should include, but not be limited to, communities at the highest risk with the highest vulnerability, including underserved communities and socially vulnerable populations. The plan should consider non-monetary benefits. 2, high-risk properties, including repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss structures, and areas under intense development pressures, and areas that may experience increasingly severe impacts from climate change. And if the state is interested in high hazard potential dam funding eligibility, the plan must describe the criteria for prioritizing those as well. So yes, we are, and we will need to do that. And finally, FEMA also suggests outside of the guidance, prioritize funding for mitigation projects that target buyouts in regions with high occurrences of repeat damage where critical salmonid habitats are present. This is about flooding. Okay, Marianne.
Yeah, I'm curious about the non-monetary benefits. Does that include like health benefits, mental health, physical health, social health?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I would say so.
Oh, awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions? I know this is a lot to digest. Okay, Leotis, there's a link in the chat up toward the beginning of the meeting. Thank you, Susan. Susan just put it back in the chat again. Okay, so we have taken this and made it into a table and, divided all the ands and listed all these criteria. And so we have shown which ones are required by FEMA, which ones are suggested by FEMA, and then the ones that DLCD and OEM decided to add to this list. So let's start with those. And just I want to take comments now and suggestions for when we get to the suggested ones, suggestions for whether we want to include this, whether we don't want to include this, whether we want to change the language, fine tune it a little bit. And then also other suggestions. I think the total is 11. Is that correct? Yeah, thank you. And take your other suggestions for other criteria you think we should have and discuss them among us. So the first 5 are required. 1 is the degree to which benefits are maximized. And so that would be a way to understand that would be addressing multiple hazards and potentially other priorities such as green infrastructure as a way to mitigate hazards. The floor is open. Okay, go ahead, Marianne. Oh, that's not a hand. You like that one.
Oh,
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just going to say, I like it when they get into a little bit of example, like such as green infrastructure. To me, that gives it much more substance. I mean,
Mhm.
same thing with the non-monetary benefits down in number 6, right? It would be great if there was a such as to
Okay.
help clarify.
Yeah, the such as in number 1 that came out of our DLCD and OEM conversation. But we can add a such as. Are there other examples that anybody would like to put into a such as?
I think resilient energy sources.
Resilient energy sources?
Losing power is such a big
Mm-hmm.
thing, right?
Okay. Okay, for number 2, for HMGP, that's hazard mitigation grant program and hazard mitigation grant program post-fire. Those are FEMA's post-disaster grant offerings. The directly impacted jurisdictions, like Hale was just talking about, as identified in the disaster declaration. So when there's a disaster declaration, the declaration says these counties have been affected by this hazard, and that's where the funding is directed first. Okay, for number 3, deliver at least 40% of the funding. And this is our language again. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see your hands. Go ahead, Deanna, and then Murph.
So for 2,
Mhm.
HMGP traditional, not post-fire. So the examples of that are like elevation, house elevation, structure elevation, buyout, or floodproofing for an example project. Is that
For-
correct for the HMGP item?
I think it could be. Cal, do you want to speak to that?
If you're actively mitigating a problem, then yes. If you've got, an area that continues to flood and they have buildings that need to be, risen up, or trying to think of other examples, but that definitely would correlate over to HMGP post-disaster, not just pre-disaster.
Okay, that's helpful. I think for notes, we might want to add in, this is what I would suggest. We might want to add in here that we received the FEMA letter for prioritizing buyouts for salmonoid species regarding the biological opinion in Oregon. Even though it's under 7 as well, the repetitive loss section, I think it could also be applied for subsection 2.
I think that's number 9, Deanna.
Oh, okay, yeah, it is there.
But if you
But
wanted to add some examples in number 2, that would be great. And when we get to number 9, you can add examples
okay,
to that or others, other comments.
all right.
Yeah.
I could plug in the document to the chat if needed.
Oh,
But
I don't think
we
it
don't.
is, but you can if you want.
Okay.
So new to this, berms for HMGP. Kyle, can you please unmute? Well, or wait a second and actually go ahead. I'm sorry, Murph, because this is a
No,
I think
just clarifying what would count for that. That's all. I'm just trying to figure those things out.
so. Can you give us a little bit more about what you mean about berms?
Oh, just like floodwater protection or mitigation, but that would probably be 9 as well. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you for coming. Where are you from? I'm not familiar.
Just Klamath County.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. Um, All right, sorry, Murph, thank you for waiting.
Thanks, Marion. Well, I got to bring up something I brought up last time, and that is planning for transitional housing at local government level to make sure that there's no blocks for FEMA trailers or things of that nature. When we have identified areas that are high risk, so we know where there's a high risk fire danger or a high risk flood danger. We know that people are going to possibly lose their homes. Where are we going to house people for transitional housing? And are we going to have the infrastructure in place? And how long is it going to take to put that in place? Do we pre-plan for that? Do we, that's my 10 cents worth on this.
Okay. Hale, can you just say what you are putting in the chat, please?
Oh, yeah, I just put a snippet from the grant announcement for the 5,500 that talks about all of our priorities and gives additional examples on what we score on. So if it's directly, if their project's directly related to wildfire mitigation, if it's outlined in their NHMP and directly relates to their plan, and also if they're located in a community disaster resilient zone. So I just wanted to post those additional things that we score on.
Okay, right. The community disaster resilience zones are in number 3 here, but these are actual examples from an offering, a specific grant offering. And they also coincide with one of our FEMA required criteria. So that's good. Okay, Murph again. You're muted.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mary. I had nothing to add on this one.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay, thanks. Susan?
I had a question about number 2. I know for the post-fire NOFO, I mean, there were some counties that weren't part of the declaration, but they were impacted, you know, more like in Eastern and Central Oregon. So I don't know, is there a way in our suggested criteria to also, you know, prioritize those counties over like some counties in Western Oregon, for example? Like if it's that competitive, so they weren't officially part of the declaration, but they were impacted, but not up to that financial level. Just a thought.
We can always look and see if they've received grant funds before. And if they have not, then that would elevate them in the scoring matrix, because we do want to help those communities that are small and underrepresented and don't have the manpower or force to apply for these grants. That's why we have a dedicated team of 5 grant representatives to help them with technical assistance. But there are ways that we can go about helping them get funds, even if they are not directly, not considered directly affected in that disaster.
So Susan, why don't you put in the notes then that we want to I don't know, consider affected jurisdictions, but those affected jurisdictions don't rise to the level of a presidential disaster declaration. And before we come to Lisa, I wanted to ask what folks think about that idea. Is that something that we would want to add as one of our own criteria? Should we make a line 12 for that?
Lisa has her hand up.
Yeah, I know. I just wanted to ask that question first before we went on to something else. So is there anybody who would disagree with that? No, I don't. Okay. So Lisa, you're up.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so Lisa Gorsuch, and I realize that we have a lot to get through and not endless time, but I wanted to bring up something that comes up often and particularly related to the most recent fire season as we talk about pre and post grant opportunity and relating to infrastructure, such as for a small cooperative. And I'll use an example of Columbia Power electric cooperative that sustained through a combination of 3 different wildfires this summer, and then also microbursts as a result of a lightning storm that actually ignited some fires, but really it was the wind damage. They had several million, upwards of $10 million in damage for a small cooperative nonprofit that serves only 1,100 customers in the state. So enough to just about wipe out a utility. And we have a problem with timing for the utilities with that qualify for grants with pre or post during an incident. They aren't like other businesses or residents that are going to be supported in recovery post event. That there is a real-time need for funding opportunities due to the fact that they've got to get the critical service restored as soon as possible. And our goal, of course, would be any utility, while putting this infrastructure back in place, repairing, that they would build back more resilient. But when there's a funding concern, they're going to work as quickly to get it back up safely and, just functioning, even if it's just to.
Whoops, we lost you. Are you still there, Lisa? We can't hear you anymore. Oh, okay. Well, we'll come back to Lisa when she comes back on. I think,
To image.
oh, Lisa, we
Yes,
lost
can you hear?
you.
Oh, sorry about that. I apologize, having some connection issues. Well, I don't want to take up a lot more time, and it may be an inappropriate time, but I was just bringing up this question of whether there is an opportunity for grant funding that would be more real time for critical infrastructure, that there could be criteria established uh, to serve restoration of critical infrastructure, not pre or post event, but somewhat, real time as infrastructure is being put back in service.
Okay, I don't know of anything like that, but we could, that sounds kind of like a mitigation action to try to find that kind of funding.
Yeah, and again, I don't want to get us off track, and
Okay.
it's too complicated to dive into, but I wanted to capture that because it's certainly something that comes up, be it fires or winter storm, that there are missed opportunities for building back more resilient because they have to build back immediately. And then there's that lost opportunity. So we can pursue it later, but I appreciate the time and being able to share that and capture it in notes. Thank you.
Okay, great, sure. Okay, so are there any more comments on number 2? Can we move to number 3? Okay, so Kale, I'm probably going to need some words from you on this because I don't remember what EDRC stands for right off. But FEMA has this requirement of delivering at least 40% of the funding to disadvantaged communities. So there are 2 ways to have disadvantaged communities in FEMA funding land. One is if you're this EDRC community, where if you are awarded a FEMA grant, your share of the cost is only 10% instead of the normal 25. So you get 90% funding instead of 75% funding. Thank you. Economically disadvantaged rural communities. Thank you. And there is a specific bar you have to meet to be considered one of those. There's a formula for it. And then CDRs. That's another one. CDRZ. Community disaster resilience zones. Yes. Okay. And those are also set out by FEMA. And so if your community is one of those two types, at least 40% of the funding has to go to those communities. And on the non-disaster side, well, number 3 applies to non-disaster as well. And the others, 4 and 5, are to increase resiliency and reduce vulnerability overall. And to link climate change adaptation to the identified risk. So are there comments on those two? Or questions? No?
Yeah, I guess on the climate change part of it, link climate change adaptation to identified risk. I suppose I'm wondering if you have what climate change science source are you using, and is it need to be specified, or maybe it doesn't need to be specified? So is it, what's the source of the climate change data that you're using, or
I would think that the identified risk that we would be using would be the risk that we identify in our state plan.
Yeah, so I guess that would be included in what Chris is doing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then maybe that's where it's identified, but it seemed kind of vague to me, and I was like, well,
I think we could write that better.
maybe as identified in the state risk assessment or something.
Right, thank you. Yes, Marianne.
Following up on that comment, would local adaptation plans count also? So a state risk assessment or a local risk assessment? So like here in Lincoln County, we've got a climate and health adaptation plan. We've got a climate and health assessment.
Mm-hmm.
Would those count?
I would think so for the local plans. Yes.
That's great, because a lot of times they're actually more substantive because they're more specific.
Right. Well, let's think this through. So these are criteria that are going to go in the state plan, and they're going to be used by OEM to weigh applications. So we're going to have that risk identified in the state plan. But if you have additional information about that risk at the local level, there's no reason that you couldn't include that in your application to be considered by OEM. I think that would be the way to think about it. Cal, I'm so glad you're here. Are you
I
still?
was just going to type in the chat that I have a 2:00 meeting that I have to hop up for. So I am not super versed in non-disaster. I'm really focused on the post-disaster side. So I'm not sure if I have any constructive feedback for this one.
Okay. But I think, Marianne, a good rule of thumb is to give whatever information you have that supports your position and your application. Murph?
Thank you. Under number 4, reduce vulnerability, Um, this would be through community awareness. I think programs that bring agency to community for awareness at local risk, which I see happening in my own neighborhood right now through the Mount Hood Corridor Wildfire Partnership. It has agency and community organizations coming together to plan. And this has been extremely successful in the last 2 years, and it seems to be growing. I think it's a fantastic idea. We're mixing nonprofit to help on some of our vulnerabilities, bringing this awareness to residential homeowners on how to harden. And this is multi-agency at state level and county levels coming together and sit down with community organizations. I think it's extremely impressive.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I think we had some discussion last week too on the goals about making sure that people know what their risks are.
Yeah.
And yes. Okay. See, we have a time check. Okay. So the following ones are FEMA suggestions. Of course, they would like to see us use these, but they're technically suggestions. So we have some more leeway here. So number 6 is communities at the highest risk with the highest vulnerability, including underserved communities and socially vulnerable populations. And the plan should consider non-monetary benefits when we're talking about that. So comments, suggestions, is this something we want to keep? Is it something we want to ditch? Is it something we want to change? Well, Marianne?
So as a public health person, I really like the idea of including non-monetary benefits such as physical health, mental health, social health, and well-being. Oops, what happened
Physical,
to the...
mental, and social health? Health and well-being, is that, did I get that right?
Yeah, yeah, that sounds good.
Okay,
So like, and that could be a such as, yeah.
okay,
Thank
great,
you.
sure. Anybody else? Christina?
I think this might be the place to add it, that maybe there's some sort of historical consideration as well, in terms of underserved communities and socially vulnerable populations. They might, roll out slightly different statistics these days depending on how you slice things, but having some room to consider historically underserved communities.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay, anyone else? All right, then. Oh,
Sorry,
go ahead.
Megan, finding my hand raised while sharing my screen is challenging, so I'm just gonna unmute. I was just curious, it says the plan should consider non-monetary benefits. That seems oddly specific, because it could be a plan or a project or, so I'm not sure if that word, the plan.
I think that's just famous poor writing, the state NHMP.
Oh, the state, gotcha. Thank you. Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, Christina again?
One more thought, and maybe this arches over across a number of these, but when one of the conversations I know we've had with FEMA in the past when we're trying to argue, a given community should be prioritized for assistance in some way, or that we're going to get to partner with them and create maps for them for potentially, is are we talking about the total number of people? Like if you have two communities, one has a higher population than the other, you might invest more in, 50 people in the higher population area are at risk versus a greater proportion in a smaller community. Um, it's just a conversation I've had, and I don't know if when you says something like communities at the highest risk,
Mhm.
I wonder how we measure that. Is it proportional to the community or is it the total number of people assisted?
Chris, do you want to jump in here?
Yes, so in the risk assessment, we are using proportional precisely because a small number of people in a large population is not as affected as a small number of people in a small population.
Great, that's a very clear answer. Thank you, Chris.
But that being said, there are some people in the hazard mitigation community who believe we should be helping the most people, no matter whether, what the proportion is.
Mm.
But our risk assessment is proportional. And that tends to favor more rural areas, as you can well imagine. That's what we're finding in the risk assessment. But so there might be a little trade-off you have to do, the second tier look.
So if this is the moment where we have the opportunity to like steer the criteria a little bit, I
Mhm.
guess for all the folks on the call, do we have an opinion or overarching direction we want to head?
Ooh. We could have a whole nother meeting on that, couldn't we?
Sorry to open a can of worms.
This is the time to chime in. Leotis, is this something that you would like to chime in on, or do you have a different topic to bring up?
Yeah,
And am I
no,
pronouncing your name correctly?
yeah, it's correct. Sorry, my name is Leotis McCormick, Confederated Tribes Umatilla Indian Reservation. So I think this might be appropriate to capture maybe some of the tribal perspective as well, and some of the considered underserved communities. A lot of there's other values that are a little bit significant to tribes that might not have been considered in other areas of the plans. Sacred sites, things of that nature, historical, religious places, different, just a way to capture sort of the tribal perspective, if that makes sense. That's a little bit, maybe a little bit unique than some of the other counties. We're currently working with Umatilla County in their CWPP process, and getting, working with the county themselves to try to capture some of those interests within their plan itself. And so if we could, insert the tribal perspective, and sort of capture the intrinsic value of some of those things that are non-monetary. You can't really put a value on some of those things more than just plan to try to protect them and mitigate around them, if that makes sense. And so just wanted to make sure that part was captured a little bit in line with what everybody else was saying.
Okay. Do you want to list things looking at the notes, do you want to make sure we captured things besides sacred sites?
Yeah, there's like I said, and it's kind of a difficult one because the tribe has a management plans, beyond emergency management that fits emergency management. For instance, their forestry plan includes prescribed burning, things like, things of that nature. And so, there's the way that our natural resources department sort of manages their our first foods. And so some of our specific, I guess, foods and medicines that we use, that are, again, that are specific to different areas, that grow in specific communities and parts of the areas. And we just want to make sure that those are captured and considered, because again, is when you have a plan that might not understand the significance of what, a certain bush that is that's a food for our elk habitat, if that makes sense. You know what I'm saying? And so just so that there's a place for our management process and our management plan to be considered when we're creating criteria, if that makes sense. And we understand it. I mean, again, it's just, there's a lot of consideration and things that we have to consider, but at least, that perspective is considered, looked at, and as a part of the conversation. So it's more broad than specific. I think there's so many things we could go on specifically just for tribes in this process, but again, just don't want to take over specifically, but just sort of broadly see if we can at least take note of the tribal perspective. And I think what she's capturing now is kind of what I'm trying to communicate, if that makes sense.
Great, good. I want to make sure that we get it down right. Murph, I'm going to ask you to hold again because I think Chris has something very germane to this to say,
Yeah,
about
so,
how we're doing
so
the risk assessment.
I recognize that some of those sites are not able to be shared with the public. And I wonder if this in the notes we can reflect on, or we can add something that says that when these decisions are made, we look at the local plans as well. So that we're reflecting the local considerations as well as the statewide ones.
Right. So it would be local and tribal.
Tribal, yes, local and tribal, but in this case, particularly tribal, because there are many things that we would like to evaluate in the state plan, but we just don't have the information, and that there are good reasons for that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Murph?
Thank you. This
Thank
is
you for
just,
waiting again.
oh, no problem. This is a suggestion. In front of the word communities, could we go cultures/communities? I think that would kind of hit on what Leotis was just talking about.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about that, Leotis?
I mean, yeah, I think it's appropriate. Again, I just, and I don't, one of the difficult things sometimes is the misunderstanding of, the relationship that tribes do have with the state and the community or the counties. And again, if that's something that can capture what the intention is, and I don't have any problem with that. But I do agree with, the culture aspect of it does sort of highlight that it, again, the community might be a little bit unique and different from the tribe. So I like that recommendation. I think it's appropriate.
Okay, thank you. Do you have more, Murph?
No, that's it.
Okay, Philip?
Hi, I just want to mention that I fully agree with that, and also it really fits in with number 9, specifically the salmonid habitats. That's also an important part of tribal culture and needs. So really, those two really join together very much, I think.
Okay. Can you bring that back up so we don't lose it when we get to number 9?
Sure.
Thank you. Okay. So we've got a lot of comments here on number 6. Let's take a minute to look at what FEMA's suggestion is and try. I know that that writing in a group is really difficult, but let's try to come up with a sentence or two that we feel is better than what FEMA has here. That really, in addition to adding the word cultures, how else would we like to frame this that that will work for Oregon and all of us who live here? Did we want to, before we move on, and while you're thinking about this, the middle comment here, whether we want to talk a little bit here about proportional risk versus the greatest number of people? We brought that up and then we sort of went on to a bunch of other comments, and this is the place to discuss that briefly if we have 1 hour left to get through the rest of this today. So keeping that in mind, I think we have a few minutes to talk about this.
Since I brought up, this is Christina from Dogami, since I was the one who brought up the proportional versus total number of people impacted for risk. I mean, if the advantage to leaving it as is it could be open to interpretation by OEM as they're processing other grant applications in the future. So if we don't make a decision today, it does leave things more flexible. That said, if someone has a strong opinion that it should be one way or the other, this would maybe be an opportunity to get that down. And the advantage I see to working under the proportional skew for where funding would go is, often the smaller communities have far fewer resources and overall to address different types of hazards. So I don't personally mind, and especially wanting to give support to communities that don't have the other types of human and monetary resources. I'm not upset with that. It was just a question.
Okay. Thank you. Would anybody else like to weigh in on that? Okay, well, so we open that question. Does anybody have any other suggestions for rewording this criterion? Okay. I will say now, and I'll try to remember to say again later, that we're going to try to the point of the next meeting next Friday, same time, same place, is to prioritize the criteria that we're talking about today and trying to come to some agreement on. At this point, I feel like we have some agreement on this, but any ideas that you have afterward, I would appreciate having them emailed to me or to Trisha Patterson by next Wednesday. And the other place that you can weigh in is on our website where you downloaded this. There's a link to submit comments. And so either of those ways would be great if you could do that by next Wednesday. So you don't have to be completely done today. If you're thinking about this, we can take some more comments later for a few days before we get to next week where we want to prioritize these. Okay, so moving on to number 7. High-risk properties, including repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss structures. Repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss structures are defined under the National Flood Insurance Program. And so this is specific to flood. And repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss structures have criteria that define them, but they are really places that flood over and over again, and that FEMA pays for repairing over and over again, or perhaps elevating or doing something to get them out of that status. Sometimes they're buyouts, sometimes they're elevations. And so if we want to, as a state, continue to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, we really have to have some criteria around prioritizing repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss structures. So it's a suggestion because we don't have to participate in the NFIP, but we are participating in the NFIP, so it's really not a suggestion. But if there's something that we want to, if there's some way we want to change this a little bit to say something different, maybe about repetitive loss versus severe repetitive loss, or any other kind of way that we might want to refine or revise this suggested slash required criterion, this is the time. So Murph.
Build back better. Buyout.
Okay. And would you apply that to both or one or?
If a Build Back Better would solve the solution, you're saying specific flooding, that would be remove the structure, move, buy out, land,
Okay.
something of that nature.
Okay, I think those are mitigation actions.
Yes.
What kind of criterion would we use for those properties to give them some priority in the structure of awarding grants? Okay, Marianne.
Kind of goes back to our earlier conversation about what's important to different communities.
Mhm.
So what I was thinking is to prioritize like essential service facilities like hospitals, fire departments, etc. And then cultural facilities, properties with high cultural value, as mentioned in number 6. If that makes sense to put it here also.
So what we would be saying then is that we want to prioritize high-risk properties, including repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss structures. So we're giving the such ases as essential. So high-risk properties that are not only repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss structures, but also essential facilities and I forget what adjective you use for the properties. I guess I'm trying to figure out if what you're saying is in addition to repetitive and severe repetitive loss structures or other structures that we should be prioritizing.
It's kind of like a second
It's
tier.
Okay.
Sorry,
Would
go
it
ahead.
be? We keep talking at the same time. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I think that it sounds good as is, the repetitive loss, severe repetitive loss. I like the building back better and the buyouts. That makes sense. But within that world of repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss, you may need to prioritize because you can't do everything, right?
Right.
Is what I was thinking.
Okay. Thank you. That's what I was trying to figure out. So it's a second tier. It's not a separate new criterion.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
And then the cultural value, cultural important. Yeah.
Okay. Culturally important. Okay, okay, we got that. Great. Okay. Anything else on this one, anybody? Deanna, are you here? Do you have anything else you want to say about this? Rachel?
Deanna had to drop off for another meeting.
Oh, okay. So Rachel's still here and Murph has his hand up. So go ahead, Murph.
I would like to just, maybe this isn't the time to do it, but if water control features are causing this flooding, such as levees, because it's channelized an aggressive river, and we have erosion. I'm not sure how to put this in words, but if removing a water control feature to access floodplain for energy absorption, is that possible? This is where Paul could probably help me.
Yeah. If he's still here.
Yeah.
Well, I don't see him on the list anymore. Rachel has something to say. Thanks, Rachel. Go ahead.
Hi, I was just going to add on to the prioritizing building back better. We could maybe consider adding like encouraging adoption of higher standards into local floodplain codes.
Okay. Okay, so if removing a water control feature would reduce flood risk. Is that what you're getting at, Murph? You're muted.
Sorry, yes, exactly.
Okay.
Maybe I'm gonna try and tap into Paul's brain a little bit here and suggest maybe there's a more generic language beyond that of like a bigger picture way to reduce flood risk. I don't quite have the words for it, but if there are like larger scale multi-reach, whether they're setback levies in combination with restoration or other types of projects that affect multiple properties, not just a single high risk property.
As a reach.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm going.
Yes.
Yeah, Kyle, I think multi-reach watershed scale flood risk reduction projects. Yeah.
Perhaps analysis before that, analysis / project.
Mm-hmm. Because those can be much more long-term in their benefits as well.
Exactly.
Because yeah, rivers are dynamic and levees are temporary features ultimately in the landscape.
So that would go back to number 1, which is the degree to which benefits are maximized, address multiple hazards, potentially other priorities. Okay, great. Thank you.
This would also serve as a wildfire break, so to speak. It'd be a fire break done correctly.
Okay. All right. Okay, so let's go to number 9. Prioritize funding for mitigation projects that target buyouts in regions with high occurrences of repeat damage where critical salmonid habitats are present. So that was who was on that? Philip.
Like the example of the salmonid habitat and how that is interconnected with tribal culture and needs, but also with non-tribal communities where salmon fishery for locals is a very important cultural and recreational aspect. And if we don't look after those resources, both the tribes and the rest of the communities will definitely suffer from that. And those can be very, very important. From a cultural anthropology perspective, you see worldwide very many communities that have lost that type of access, and that has really changed the face of that community and their social, cultural, and even emotional and physical health and well-being. So that's, to me, a very, very important aspect.
Apologize for having to get up there. Have we captured what you're saying? Philip, I'm sorry. I had to get up for a second. Have we captured what
Yeah,
you're
sorry,
saying?
I was on mute. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think it does, because it's very important for both tribal and non-tribal communities.
Okay. Murph?
Yeah, I was just going to hit on a little bit more of that, and perhaps critical salmonoid habitats should be where they are present or had a historical presence. If you're restoring an actual salmon salmonoid area.
Yeah, I agree. You know, and you can even go further and go beyond the salmonid habitat, but also other shellfish and aquatic life that is traditionally, historically, culturally utilized. And so, you know, example here in Coos Bay with a lot of developments, dredging has very mixed feelings in both the local community, the non-tribal local community, as well as with the tribal community, with destruction of seagrass beds, etc., as well as oyster areas and other mollusk gathering or harvesting growth areas.
No, I agree. Absolutely.
Okay. Susan?
I had a thought too. It was mentioned, you know, non-tribal community needs, cultural and recreational. I think also economic probably should be in that list. You know, if we're looking at, yeah, buyouts that could also have economic benefits, like protecting those fisheries or other, you
I
know,
fully agree.
yeah, usual and customary uses. So great, thanks.
Hey, just checking, Rachel, if you had anything to add, since this was really, its genesis is in the biological opinion implementation.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add.
Okay. All right, number 10. So, this one is about local NHMPs, and we actually have this in our current plan, and we have had it for some time, but it's still up for grabs here, for discussion. So it's, the criterion would be the status of a jurisdiction's natural hazard mitigation plan. Either they don't have one, in which case they would be a higher priority. Their plan is expired would be the next priority. The plan is expiring within 18 months, which means it needs to be updated pretty soon, or it's expiring later than 18 months. It has some more life left in it. Just like the state plans, the local plans have to be, and tribal plans have to be updated every 5 years. So this is a way of making sure that on the planning side of things and on the capability and capacity building side of things, the jurisdictions get some consideration. Yes, Jason.
Yeah, I just wanted to confirm, when we talk about status here, I read that to mean the status in the eyes of FEMA, formally acknowledging and accepting the plan. Is that accurate? And then also I wonder if it's worth adding language that says, you know, most in Oregon, there's a recommendation or I don't know if it's a requirement to have cities update their comprehensive plan or counties update their comprehensive plan to incorporate the mitigation plan. And if they haven't gone through that technical exercise, it would be unfortunate if they couldn't benefit from a grant or some other project award if they haven't gone through that additional step of the comp plan amendment.
Yes, no, that yes and no. They can even without having updated the comprehensive plan to integrate their natural hazard mitigation plan or append their natural hazard mitigation plan, jurisdictions can still be eligible for FEMA grants. So as long as they have a current, that means approved by FEMA within the last 5 years, natural hazard mitigation plan, they can still apply for mitigation grant funds from FEMA. And there's no so there's no requirement to do that, but we encourage them to do that. And we could add that as a criterion, has a jurisdiction integrated their NHMP with their comprehensive plan? If yes, they get higher billing. And to your other question, your first question, what does status mean? In FEMA's eyes, the status is you're either approved or expired. Your plan is either approved or expired. So it's if it's been more than 5 years and the plan hasn't been updated, then it's expired. And if it's still within those 5 years, then it's still approved and current. But for some of the grants, you have to have the jurisdiction has to have a current plan at the time of application and at the time of grant obligation.
And I guess just a counter point consideration to this idea that the city or county must incorporate the mitigation plan into its comprehensive plan. Where I was going with that is that's a technical exercise, a legislative exercise. That it would be unfortunate if there was a disadvantaged community and some disaster happened or something and they couldn't receive or receive less priority for funding simply because they didn't incorporate it into their comprehensive plan. So where I was going with it was maybe we should say the community need not have its mitigation plan incorporated or adopted as part of the comprehensive plan.
Oh, so that would be a separate criterion. So to help the local governments who are struggling more.
Yeah, and I don't know that it's a separate criterion so much as it is more of just a notice to let any potential applicant know they're not going to get penalized or get a lower priority simply because they haven't completed that step.
It's a separate step than what number 10 is. That's why I was thinking it would be a separate entry. What other folks think? Susan, you've got your hand up.
Well, actually, thank you for clarifying that, Jason. So, because I don't think that anybody considers or OEM doesn't consider whether a comp plan's been has incorporated a natural hazard mitigation plan or not. And that's not even a consideration, as I understand, for making these grant decisions. But would it be helpful from a local government perspective if there was a separate criteria, under planning and capacity building that would maybe elevate some projects, not over hazard mitigation plan updates, but could help elevate planning projects that would provide that technical assistance to a community to actually go that next step? Because that's something we hear that communities want to do.
Yeah, I think that would be great.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So let's add a number 12 there. Or you could let's add a number 12 to the table.
Technically be able to do that. Okay. 12.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, and while that's happening, Murph?
Just to ask a question on this, how does this affect FEMA flood insurance if you do not have a plan?
Well, Chris, correct me. Chris, are you still here? Correct me if I'm wrong. Or Rachel, you're here. Do you want to answer this question? I think as long as the jurisdiction is in compliance with the NFIP, which means they have regulations in their development code that that implement the NFIP and are consistent with it, then they don't have to have a natural hazard mitigation plan. But if they do have a natural hazard mitigation plan, then they should be including flood in their natural hazard mitigation plan. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah. And just to add to Jason's comment, you know, if an underserved community was not being considered for funding, what if there was critical infrastructure that needed repair or replacement? That would be something you'd be robbing from that community, so to speak, or preventing that infrastructure. So I'll just leave it there.
Okay, I'm not, can you say that one more time? I don't
Well,
think I got that.
Jason made the comment that if they did not have a natural hazards mitigation plan in an underserved community, so to speak, would that limit their access to funding after a disaster? And if so,
Yes.
what does that do to critical infrastructures?
Well, you're right. If a community doesn't have a natural hazard mitigation plan, then they won't qualify for FEMA grants. But there are also other funding opportunities for some critical infrastructure. So it's not necessarily the end of the line for them. But I see that other people have their hands up. So Gianna?
Hi, Gianna Alessi, mitigation planner. There are special districts that manage like critical infrastructure that do have NHMPs throughout the state. So I'm not sure if we want to somehow address that with the special jurisdictions that are a part of maybe a county or have their own individual NHMP. A water district or school district or other sorts of essential infrastructure. So that was just a thought. I'm not sure how we would address that in the criteria, but.
Chris?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that when a community's plan has recently expired or is about to expire and an event happens, we have in the past pulled out the stops and got them a plan as quickly as possible. Certainly by the time the grant is obligated. So I'm not sure we want to exclude communities whose plans have expired, and I'm not even sure we want to put them lower on the priority list because they may be the ones that really need it. So maybe there's a metric in there about how long it's been expired, or if they've never had one, that would be a exclusionary or lower priority. But I can think of a few cases where it was on the cusp of expiring or just expired, and we found a way to get it updated so that they could apply for grants.
Yeah, there's also the extraordinary circumstances exception that can help in some circumstances to allow a jurisdiction to apply for a project funding, a mitigation project funding, while they have a year to get a plan in place.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, Gianna?
Would we want to say something like never developed or expired if they're expired but they're working on their plan currently, they're updating it, versus like if they're expired and they are not working on it? Would we want to make that note that difference? Because then if they're expired but they're continually to work on it, that shows motivation, and they're able to maybe incorporate some of these plans into their mitigation actions or this application. So I feel that within the definition of expired or never developed, there is some more nuance with if there are in the middle or moving towards getting an NHMP. They have some plans in place.
Yeah, I think I heard some discussion about whether a jurisdiction that has never developed a plan ought to be higher priority or lower priority. Let's save that for next time. And so your comment goes, I think, in that same bucket of how expired are they? That we'll have to prioritize these criteria next time. But the question for today is, what do we want these criteria to be? Okay, Susan?
I had a clarifying question. So this is the suggested, I mean, FEMA has the requirement, you can't have an expired plan, right? When you apply for these grants in general for projects, you can have an expired plan if you're applying for a grant to update your plan. So it's a grant for planning. But are we saying with number 10, DLCB and OEM suggests that if we have multiple entities, jurisdictions applying for grants to update their plans, OEM's gonna prioritize those applications for communities that don't have NHMPs or their NHMPs are expiring. Is that what this criteria is about? Like how we prioritize applications for updating NHMPs?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And our current plan, the thinking was that we want to have jurisdictions get, have NHMPs. So we would want to, and this is the prioritization that is in our plan now that, for this criterion, that jurisdictions without a plan ever before would be prioritized over those that are expired, and those over the ones that are expiring soon, and those over the ones that are expiring later. So these are the current actually prioritizations of this section of the criteria currently, but we may want to think about this completely differently in this plan update. And we may want to include this as a criterion, and we may not want to include this as a criterion, and we may want to change it altogether. So that's in front of us right now. Did you want, yeah, go ahead, Susan. That was it? Okay, Chris?
I just wanted to make sure the notes reflected the extraordinary circumstances rule. I
Okay.
think if they do qualify for that extraordinary circumstances rule for a project, then that's different than if they don't. And I also think we should clarify whether number 10 refers to planning grants or project grants.
This is planning grants because currently it's planning grants, but it could apply
That's
to
not
one.
clear. Yeah.
Right. So let's go for the overall question. Is this something that we think we should have in the plan?
Yes, I think so. As someone who works with communities to update their plans, I mean, this is what we do anyway. We try to figure out who has an expired plan. So working with OEM and Mike Howard at University of Oregon, like try to get the folks with the expired plans to get their plans updated and kind of work through that process. That's our practice, at least.
Okay, so we have this list. We want to talk about whether they're in the process of updating an expired plan. We want to talk about whether they have the opportunity for an extraordinary circumstances exception. Those are all other things, other criteria we could add to this section. Am I getting this right? Murph?
This is huge, actually, if we dig into it. I mean, this has everything to do with climate change and future planning practices in building codes. Yes, this should be included, in my opinion.
Okay. All right, are we ready to move on to number 11?
So I want to note you skipped number 8.
Oh, I did?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, well, let's go back to number 8 then. Thank you. So areas under intense development pressures and areas that may experience increasingly severe impacts from climate change. Those should be 2 different ones. Can we agree on that? Okay. Okay, hearing no dissent. So areas under intense development pressures. That I don't know what I'm just going to give some thoughts here. That it's very difficult to quantify sometimes who's under intense development pressures. The local jurisdictions know that better than we do at the state level. And because of the way development is, development permits are tracked at the local level, it's different everywhere. And it's difficult for us to be able to get good data on that. So I have my questions about that one. Anybody else have any comments on that? Maybe we have a way of knowing that we don't know that we have. Marianne?
I was wondering if there's some way of combining it with 11. So I was focusing on the areas that may experience increasingly severe impacts from climate change. So you could do a do not encourage new development in hazardous areas, or including areas that may experience increasingly severe impacts from climate change. To me, they're very connected, but I don't know if I'm reading it the way you guys meant.
Well, we're here to discuss different ways of reading it, so
yeah.
that's fine. So can you say that again? Do not encourage new development in...
I was thinking of tacking I onto L. So do not encourage new development in hazardous areas, including areas that may experience increasingly severe impacts from climate change.
Okay, that would go in the notes. Sorry, Susan.
Yeah, it's just a suggestion, right?
Okay.
Including areas. Yeah, there you go. Awesome.
All right. Yeah. Okay. Comments on that?
I wonder if it needs to be slightly more specific, because arguably just about every area is becoming hazardous.
Okay.
I mean, some are, I guess, or I would say every area is going to have increasingly severe effects of climate change. So maybe, I don't know. I don't know if there's a way of, I mean, I don't know what the right way is, whether it's quantitative, qualitative, I don't know. But I feel like that could be somehow increasing the specificity.
Okay.
I mean, maybe it's something like do not encourage new development in floodplains or areas where if you maybe refine it to areas where landslides are likely or something to that effect.
Okay. I think I'm turning this over in my head. Murph?
Well, we have mapped areas of hazardous areas, whether it be flood, wildfire, slides. So how do we minimize development in those areas, or is that the question? Do we minimize areas that we've identified already at state level or federal levels, local levels, that these are extremely hazardous areas to be building in? So it's more than do not encourage. It should also be do not allow, for that matter.
Mhm. Okay. So these would be jurisdictions, we could read this as jurisdictions that don't encourage or jurisdictions that don't allow development in hazard areas or mapped hazard areas. Because say drought areas are mapped like every 2 weeks, and they're changing all the time. We don't have maps of extreme heat areas. We don't have maps of trying to think some of the more statewide kinds of areas, that don't have a specific boundary like a landslide may. Okay. So what do we think? I'm going to go back to number 8. What do we think about areas under intense development pressure? Oh, wait, I'm sorry. We have 2 people with hands up, Jason and then Chris.
Yeah, I was wondering for this one, I kind of see at least 2 buckets here where, well, 3 things. So it would be extremely challenging for many communities to say you can't develop in hazard areas at all. Now, communities could purchase property from private landowners in hazardous areas, which is a very expensive proposition, but that might be something that is prioritized, right? If there's a way to purchase those properties. But then the other bucket is if you can't disallow development, how do you mitigate in the most efficient way possible and in a way that reduces the risk? And so I wonder if those are buckets that can help to prioritize and kind of organize how we might apply that criteria.
Yeah, we did have a comment at last week's meeting about the fact that the taxpayers at large pay for the level of risk tolerance of a particular community. So if a particular community doesn't want to restrict development in any way in a hazard area, then there's going to be damage and everybody else is going to pay the bill. So that's something to think about there. And in some cases, jurisdictions have purchased property, but it is, like you said, a difficult thing to do. Chris?
I think Jason's kind of on my wavelength, and I'm wondering how this relates to mitigation and selection of mitigation projects. So I wonder if there's a way to phrase it to say that we will prioritize certain kinds of mitigation in hazardous areas, but not others. For example, we would prioritize buyouts over elevation projects. So, because right now it's just kind of a vague general statement that doesn't really relate to the selection of mitigation projects.
Right. So you're suggesting prioritizing certain types of mitigation over others.
Yes, exactly. And I think also combining it with 11 would be a good thing too.
Okay, and how would you suggest we do that?
Well, essentially, if you keep repairing stuff in a hazardous area, you are encouraging development in hazardous areas, right? Because you're keeping the community there. Whereas if you prioritize buyouts in hazardous areas, you are de facto doing managed retreat because
Mhm.
then the area becomes less attractive to new development.
Right, so that would combine also with number 9, right?
Yes, yes, in a way, but it doesn't
Yep.
only have to be buyouts. I'm
Right,
can't think of another scenario off the top of my head, but I don't want to restrict it to that mitigation action. But I just
right.
think that number 8 is more of a goal than a selection criteria.
Okay.
Chris, maybe to add on to that, you know, it's not just buyouts, but if you're putting like critical infrastructure or schools in hazardous areas, you're more likely to have residential areas built up around
Correct.
them as well, right?
Yeah,
So,
exactly. Exactly. You don't want to put stuff that attracts development in hazardous areas, or maybe you don't even want to repair it. Maybe you want to move it, like
mhm.
we've done with schools, to move the school out of a hazardous area and then the residences follow.
I think the typing that was just done was placed in row 9, and Chris was referring to row 8, I believe.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. I think we're developing a pathway here, Murph.
Does that hazardous area have another purpose that's beneficial to the community or development?
Yeah, like flood retention. Yeah.
Okay.
Can I
Okay.
can I jump in? I'm not sure.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
The jump rope game we're playing here of tag. I guess maybe there's something that I feel like is a thread through several of these, which is
Mhm.
prioritizing like these bigger picture or ultimate solutions by, you know, actually not, you know, if no more new development happens in a hazard area, that is the ultimate way to, you know, reduce risk, as opposed to just mitigate, you know, at a property by property level. Um, is there a way to capture prioritization for, I don't want to call them like they're um a whole, I'm trying to think of an overarching term to describe these solutions that um permanent is not the right word, but I'm trying to grasp for something like semi-permanently fix a problem, as opposed to a single property or a, you know, you know, elevating a structure.
Mm-hmm. So you want to take a more global view.
Yeah, yeah, I guess maybe that's a nice way to put it, and
Holistic?
a criteria, yeah.
Um, okay. So, more holistic view? Would that be a better word, or global view, or regional view, or
Regional or holistic sounds about right. Yeah. It ties into multiple benefits. It ties into
right?
lots of these factors. Um, I wish I had something more specific, but it feels like a uniting
Macro,
feeling and thread.
macro
Okay.
instead of micro.
Yes.
Macro instead of micro. Okay. Yes. Okay, so time check here. It's 10 till. And at this point, we were going to ask if there was any other community comment. and then go into next steps. But I don't know that there is anybody here who is not part of this community. So um, let's just try to wrap up here. And I think, Christina, that was a great way to encapsulate what we're talking about today. Are there any ideas that you have that we have to get down before we get out of here today? That we've missed, or other ideas for summarizing what we'd like to have, or other ideas for adding criteria? Christina?
I'd just like to throw this idea out there, and it certainly doesn't have to stick. But one of the things I've noticed is a challenge in many projects is communicating the successes of the project to external partners or even the community that it's been serving. Is there a way to acknowledge or support? Maybe it's not in this grouping. I don't know. Marion, please help me out here. But given that it's a kind of a consistent challenge, I wish there was a way to prioritize projects that had a vision for communicating the benefits of the project.
Okay.
Steer me clear if this is not where I'm supposed to go.
No, all ideas are good ideas today.
Okay.
And I don't know, I'd have to think about and potentially talk to OEM about whether that's something that could be funded in a FEMA funding application. I imagine it could.
But not all of them. Certainly some grants, that's not enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
Deliverable you could pay
But,
for with the grant.
I think it's a great idea because we don't communicate that as much as we should. Okay, Marianne.
Yeah, I like that idea also. And I was thinking that it could be part of a bigger community engagement process.
That's a good idea too. You just add it into your community engagement plan and then it's funded.
Well, and to have those components, I totally agree. It's so important as we kind of justify what we do to people. People don't have much of a sense of what we do sometimes, I think. So if we communicate it and engage people throughout the process, it's more likely to be understood and hopefully supported in the future.
Okay, those are great ideas. Anything else before we wrap up for good today? Okay, well, then we can go back to thank you all for all these ideas, and also thank you for keeping to not putting conversation in the chat. That's helped us keep this moving. I really appreciate that. And I think we have a last slide. If you can put the PowerPoint up again, please. Thank you. Okay, that's it. So next meeting, next Friday, we're gonna write up what we've heard today, and we'll post it in the notes on the website, which is, the link is right here and twice in the chat. And then we're going to work on prioritizing the criteria that we came up with today for the grant. So in the next meeting, I'm sorry, prioritize next meeting, we're going to work on prioritizing the criteria for the grants that we came up with today. And a number of people have mentioned to me that we don't have these on the calendar. So if you hear that from anybody, please suggest to them that they register and then they'll get a link to put it on their calendar. And I really appreciate everybody's time, and especially at the last minute. And have a good weekend. And hope we see you next week.
Thanks.